We now are going to welcome Neil Schmid directly from Dunhuang itself, which is always, I find, very exciting. To give Neil a brief introduction before he begins, Neil is a scholar in residence at the Dunhuang Academy, where he engages in research and publication on the visual cultures of medieval Buddhism. Neil studied Chinese and East Asian studies at Georgetown University and Waseda University in Tokyo and l'École pratique des hautes études in Paris. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania with Victor Mayer as his supervisor. And he's currently also an associated researcher at the ERC-funded Buddhist Road Project at Bochum University. His publications include a really useful summary of Dunhuang literature in the Columbia History of Chinese Literature, and in recent years, 2 very rich articles, Giving While Keeping Inexhaustible Treasuries and Inalienable Wealth in Medieval China, and The Material Culture of Exegesis and Liturgy, and a change in the artistic representations in Dunhuang Caves, circa 700 to 1000. So, I see Neil is online with us, so I'll just hand over to him now, and Neil, take it away.
Great. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you so much to IDP and also the British Library for arranging this and also for inviting me to participate. I have some interesting information to share, some new research. So I'd like to begin with the overview here is really to try to examine image, text, and ritual, and how ritual really defines image, but also text in terms of some of these sutra lecture texts. So let me begin. Let's see. No, sorry. Oh, here, sorry, yeah. Okay. So to discuss the configurations of the Lotus Sutra with regard to how ritual and these popular lectures and also these, and it proved challenging because a lot of the cartouches are not recorded. So I was hoping to sort of unpack the differences and influences where the commentaries and also these sutra lecture texts influence the art of the Lotus Sutra. Now, this is a larger project, and so what I've done is I've looked at other areas. So what I will do today is to bring some light to the Lotus Sutra from other similar phenomena, analogous phenomena, influence of ritual on the pictorial program and also the contents. And one of the things I'll do briefly is to, at the end, sort of answer some of the questions, a couple questions, basic questions, like, for example, why the chaotic configuration that we often find in Bianxiang or Jingbian, these large tableaux, which you can see here, the 28 chapters of the Lotus Sutra sort of spread around haphazardly or seemingly haphazardly. And what's the reason for that? Is it simple issues of composition, or is there something else going on? The other thing is to look at the content itself. For example, here, again, in Cave 85, the Lotus Sutra, Bianxiang, where we have groups of people in front of the Buddha. Why this particular configuration? Are there other configurations? Here, they're listening to the preaching of a text. And so what does it mean for this sutra and other sutras for the different arrangements of the listeners? So just briefly, some overview of typologies. I'm interested today in talking about Guijun, so 8th, 9th, 10th century Bianxiang and Jingbian, and also the texts that occur at this time, these Jiang Jingwan or sutra lecture texts. And so we have a number of sort of types of depictions of the Lotus Sutra here. This is this Guijun period, Mogao 12, with the Lotus Sutra there. And what we find is that this standard centripetal design, as it's called, becomes standard, right? This becomes the typical configuration. It remains constant for the next 300 years. One of the other elements that we have is below these pingfang. And in the screens, we only find the Pumenpin, or the Avalokiteshvara scripture. So that's an interesting phenomenon. Sorry, it's very slow. Yeah. The other place that we find the Pumenpin is in niches. So again, only on screens, but here this is Late Tang niche, Mogao 18. Here, if we look closely, we can see these are, the Pumenpin is placed on screens with these sort of mock hinges. They're here lining the interstice of these screens. Perhaps the most famous is Enin's diary, where he talks, for example, about the lecture on the Lotus Sutra and how it's performed. And we're very fortunate because here at Dunhuang, we have texts that tell us exactly how they're performed, the structure, the liturgical structure. And this liturgical structure corresponds exactly to what Enin himself says, how they're performed, also how they're performed in Korea and in Japan. And so they're really broken up into three parts. The first part is the introduction. The main text here is this Yad Suowen. Then the text itself, the sutra, and then the sort of ending, which was for merit and vows, and then this dispersal. But what's important for us are these two elements here. So a sutra, so the lecture on, for example, the Lotus Sutra, or, and this is quite interesting, or karmic narratives. So it could go either in the direction of something more formal, which is a discussion and exegesis on the sutra itself, or it could be slightly more entertaining and involve narratives. And we have quite a few of those narratives here from Dunhuang, which I've studied in the past. And so examples of sutra lecture texts are, for example, on Prajnaparamita Sutras, Vimalakirti, Lotus Sutra, Amitabha, Yulanban, Recompense of Kindness. And what's important for us today is to understand that there's a correspondence between the sutra lecture texts and the images, the large murals, the large tableau murals on the walls of Mogao Caves during this period. There's a very, very close correspondence. Here's, for example, how a sutra lecture text would look. This is, it's not named, but this would be a sutra lecture text on the Lotus Sutra. We start off with, on the right there, the cantor, the dujang, singing a selection of the text, and then the rest in between here is a discussion of the text, an exegesis of the text. And in this exegesis, there could be, the sutra lecture texts are quite complex. They use a variety of metaphors, they use a variety of stories. So there's this real sort of mix of narrative forms. But they're really, what's crucial to understand is that they're in a liturgical format which validates and legitimizes the text within. And so that's the big difference with Bienwen, these transformation tales. They are not a Buddhist genre, and they are not bracketed by a liturgical format that we saw in the previous slide. So the narrative texts that we find used in popular lectures are a variety, quite a few on Shakyamuni, which was very current at the time. Then these stories of karma and rebirth, and these are typically taken from tale compendiums. For example, the Xian Yu Jing, the Sutra of the Wise and Foolish, and other large compendiums that we find at the beginning of the Taisho. So one of the things that is quite interesting, so if we look at these sutra lecture texts, we can find evidence of how they've influenced the art at Dunhuang, the murals, and the content of the murals. And one example, which I'll highlight here, is in the Vimalakirti Sutra lecture text, there's a story about the Vatsa Sutra, or the Milky Light Sutra, if you will. And what it says is, so the story in Vimalakirti, the Vimalakirti Sutra, it starts off with the section where Vimalakirti, the Buddha says, oh, go see Vimalakirti, he's ill, you know, and of course everyone says no. And Ananda is asked as well, and he says, well, you know, Vimalakirti was really mean to me. You know, I was going to get milk for the Buddha, and I ran into him, and he said, what are you doing? The Buddha's as tough as nails. The Buddha doesn't need milk. And, you know, go away, go away. And so eventually Ananda hears the voice of clearly Chakra, who says, no, go get the milk, and he does. But in the Vatsa Sutra, it's a different tale. It's a tale where Ananda is sent off to get milk for the Buddha, and he runs into a Brahmin, and the Brahmin can't decide whether to be miserly or to sort of insult himself in front of his disciples by helping Buddhists. And so he devises a plan to find the most violent cow, the most unruly cow, and send Ananda to the cow in hopes of Ananda getting hurt or even killed. And so Ananda's going off to visit the cow to get the milk, and the Brahmin's disciples run into him and make fun of him. Then Vimalakirti steps in and says, what are you doing? Yeah, you know, go away, go away. The Buddha doesn't need milk either. But then he finally makes it to the cow, and the cow, who speaks human, says, no, no, please take my milk. You know, if it can help the Buddha, that's great. And so, of course, the cow is reborn as a monk, and you know, and Ananda, of course, gets his good recompense in the end as well. But it's quite a different story. And so what happens is we get this story taken from the Vatsa Sutra, put into a sutra lecture text, and then represented. This is a sutra lecture text. It's taken from, then gets represented in the images of the Vimalakirti Sutra. So here's the Vimalakirti Sutra in Mogao 9, and quite complex. And at the bottom, if you notice, there's a whole range of little narrative vignettes, and these are not clear. The cartouches are not clear. We also find these at the bottom of certain Lotus Sutra tableaux. So my hope and intention was to unpack these. And unfortunately, they're not always clear. The cartouches are not always clear. But in this case, it is. And so here is the story of Ananda and the cow, Ananda begging for milk. And you can see it occupies quite a large space. And in the Vimalakirti text, it's only a few lines. So there's a pedagogical value to the tale, and there's also an entertainment value to the tale that gets put in to the sutra lecture text. And it's that sutra lecture text that then influences this vignette. And we know that because of the cartouche, which corresponds to the sutra lecture text. So this is a very interesting case of a ritual text current at the time that is influencing the composition and also the content of here, in this case, the Vimalakirti tableau. There's another instance in Yulin 32 where we see the large tableau. I apologize for the quality of the image. And again, it occupies a rather large chunk. And so it gives us an indication of the importance of that narrative in a ritual context, because again, the cartouche comes from the sutra lecture text itself. So this is really interesting evidence of the influence of ritual texts on contemporary performed ritual texts on art here in Dunhuang. Here he is, the cow has spoken human to him and said, please take my milk, and kindly instead of brutally dealing with Ananda. Another example of the influence of a sutra lecture text on the composition and content is this Devata Sutra, a sutra which I always found bizarre. because it's very, very popular. The 37 tableaux during the Guijun period. And the popularity is sort of inversely proportional to the contents of the sutra. And it's not a common sutra, except in this context, and the sutra lecture explains why. So this is the text itself, generously sponsored by the Beishan Foundation. And it's a booklet. Here, it starts here. So here it begins, the Tian Qing Wen, Jing. And it's only a series of questions and answers. And so it ends here. And so the curious thing is, what can you do with this sutra, right? It's so short. It's often said to be the shortest sutra. I don't know if that's true, but it's very short. And it's vacuous and not in the sense of shunyata. It's very, very brief. But that's the key, right? This is why the sutra was so important. Because if you're using it with a sutra lecture text, you can sort of fill it in with whatever you want. And I found this, this is an example. This is in cave 148. It dominates the north wall. So again, that short little text, what is going on? Why would it be so important? And the only way you can explain that importance is due to the sutra lecture. And I recently found evidence of this, which was heartening. Here in K55, we have another example with these side panels. You can get a sense of how it's structured. And this is the format that we have in cave 454. And so the other day I was poking around and came across the side panels here. And up at the top, it's quite interesting because there's the Shujie Jinggang Chou Yuan, right? And what's that doing? And so here again, the goddess is asking Buddha various questions. The questions are very, very simple. And if we look closely at the text itself, this is the Q&A here. The Deva asked, who is the happiest? Who is the richest and most prosperous? Who is the most happy? Who is always ugly? Slight mistranslation, but yeah. And then he replies, and it's so vague, and that vagueness is actually ideal for a ritual context which allows for exegesis on multiple levels. So in the best spirit of the Lotus Sutra, upaya. And there are other, so also, for example, in the one commentary that we do have on this text, there's no mention of a Jinggang Chou. But we do have karmic circumstances. So we do have these narratives that were actually told in the context of sutra lectures. And we have a number of narratives here. I know these well. I translated one for my dissertation way back when. And they come, again, from these collections of narratives. So the Dunhuang texts are expansions of the ones that we find, for example, in the Ba Yuan Jing or the Xian Yu Jing. But there are also other narratives in the cartouches, for example, the karmic circumstances of Rutka. And there's a variety of these tales. We don't have those narrative texts, but it does imply that they existed at one point and they were used at Mogao or Dunhuang. So, and this is an example of the Chonu Yuanqi. So one of the great things is that this the sutra lecture itself, and its ubiquity and its power on multiple levels, actually sort of encourage certain sutras to be used. Otherwise, there's no way to explain the use of the Devata Sutra. It's it's simply too simple of a sutra and lacking in content. But that content then is put and sort of expanded in that ritual context outside the sutra itself. So So what about contemporaneous analogs? Do we have sutra lectures and their influence, elements of sutra lectures elsewhere? And a good place to look, for example, here, we have a lot of preaching scenes, but what do we have elsewhere in East Asia, in China, Korea, or Japan, that points to the importance and the function and also the ritual format of the sutra lecture? And we have at Koryuji and a number of other temples, we have these gaozuo. We have these seats that were used by the cantor and the Dharma master, just as the configuration in Dunhuang that we find in this ritual context. Here's another one, Yakushiji there. And also we have, and these date back quite far, we also have performances still today using the exact same format with the exact same bifurcation between a cantor and a Dharma master in a similar setting. Here, this is the Lotus Sutra being expounded on. And what's also interesting is that we have, this is a Kamakura gaozuo, but if you can see in the middle, because typically in Dunhuang, we just have the center depicted. But here you can see how it functioned with stairs and also this, what's called a qianji, this forward table in the front. We don't have any of these from medieval Japan, from medieval China. We have images, of course, but here we can see how they were structured and how they were used, again, in this lecture context. The situation in Japan would be a koshi. So if we look slightly later, we find something very interesting, and this is the Ishiyama-dera Engi Eimaki. And here we have this configuration of a dance wutai, a dance platform or a stage, and also the lecture going on inside. And the scroll takes us through the exterior, from the exterior of the temple precincts into the interior with the crowd, the entertainment going on, and then into the koshiki that is going on at this time. And this was said to be done for a particular emperor. But we find a configuration here between the cantor and the dujang, the cantor and the Dharma master that is quite interesting, because it's the same triangulation that we get in Mogao or Dunhuang, Jingbian, and Bianxiang. So where are these sutra, if these sutra lectures are so ubiquitous and so popular and so important in religious life and daily religious life, where are they at Dunhuang? And I would say they're right in front of our faces, and we've actually missed them. In part because I think we've downplayed the importance of the sutra lecture or popular lecture. One of the issues with this is that these sutra lecture texts are not considered commentaries. They're often put in with bianwen, this like sort of poubelle or kitchen sink label now for anything that is slightly narrative and prosometric. So you'll find sutra lecture texts often listed with bianwen type texts or yuanqi type texts, so that it doesn't help us to understand Buddhism at Dunhuang and contemporary rituals if they're sort of sidled under the rubric of bianwen. That's changing now, but the case was that bianwen was a category that dominated any type of prosometric and narrative literature among Dunhuang texts. So here, this is probably the most obvious form. This is the Maitreya Sutra from Yulin 25. And sometimes it's explained that Buddhas here are part of the Sanhui. So this is the three assemblies that occur under the Nagapushpa tree with Maitreya's realm or Pure Land. But we do get this triangulation here again, with Buddha there as the Honzon, or the object of worship. Here we see a close-up, but the fact is that these two characters on either side appear in many images, not just this particular image, but they also appear in Amitabha images. I've never had a good explanation of who they were or what they're doing, but I think understanding them from the point of the lecture, the Jiangjing or the popular lecture, helps us understand this configuration. Here they are again in the Chintamani tableau in Mogao 158. These bodhisattvas here are typically the Tingfa Pusa. That's what they're labeled as. But I've never had an explanation of what these characters are doing or what they're up to. But they're clearly sitting at what might be considered a type of gaozuo, or chair, high chair, analogous to what we find in the sutra lecture. Again, here with the Amitabha Sutra tableau, we find a similar configuration. And so I think my sutra, sorry, this is very slow. Okay. I think here, yeah, for example, this is a silk painting. We also find similar characters on either side. I'm waiting for the image to catch up. Okay. Anyway, we find, but what we don't find, for example, which is very interesting in the context of the Lotus Sutra, we don't find those characters. We don't find the two characters. We don't find the two, what would be the cantor and the Dharma master on either side. And this is because it's not within temple precincts. This is important. So, of course, this is Vulture Peak, also in the Lankavatara Sutra, where the preaching takes place on Mount Malaya. There's no cantor and Dharma master. So I think it's helpful for understanding the configuration of these spaces. And of course, this is considered this would be considered a lecture, obviously, a type of lecture with adherents in a lecture structure. A close-up of that. So just briefly to conclude, the Sutra lecture, a popular lecture, because it was so important, because it was a core element of religious life, we would expect it in some ways to configure art, and it clearly does. This is initial research, but I think it, both in terms of narrative content of murals, this is the case. It's quite clear. In terms of associated narratives with scriptures, for example, the circumstances of the ugly girl, and all the other narratives that then become associated with particular scripture through the ritual of sutra lectures. And of course, the iconographic content and configuration of the jingbian, or the large tableau, the large murals that we find during this period. And I think this is important because it's something that we've overlooked, and no one would dispute that these the images of architecture represent temples or palaces, Tang Dynasty, for example, temples and palaces. There's no reason not to think that there might be associated rituals depicted. And I think then in that sense, it makes sense to use this framework to begin to examine the framework of the popular lecture or sutra lecture, to begin to examine contents, also the configuration, even particular programs and visual programs in the Mogao Caves, in the Dunhuang Caves. Oops, yeah, and of course, this understanding of scriptures. Thank you.